Good afternoon and welcome to this live CoinDesk webinar on the state of the industry. We're going to talk today about regulation for now and regulation for the future. My name is Nick Lord and I'm your moderator today. The long-term growth of the cryptocurrency market and its vast potential are really undeniable now. Investors and institutions all face a huge, wide spectrum of opportunities, but all of these opportunities require an understanding of the regulatory landscape. So in this webinar, we will provide an overview of the current landscape, how the industry is responding and what avenues for success lie ahead. I'm joined today by two people who are absolutely at the forefront of the developing crypto regulatory system. Jeremy Sheridan is VP of Regulatory Affairs at Prime Trust, where he oversees the regulatory strategies. He engages with federal and state agencies, as well as being a regulatory thought leader for the fintech and crypto industries. Now, prior to joining Prime Trust, Jeremy had 20 years of law enforcement experience and leadership in investigations for the United States Secret Service under the Department of Homeland Security. Jeremy, welcome.
Thanks.
We also are honored to have Kristin Smith, the Executive Director of the Blockchain Association, where she leads the crypto industry's development of a strategic roadmap for public policy. She's an experienced policy professional with senior level experience in both House and Senate offices, as well as private sector experiences, advocating for companies in the telecoms, internet, and other tech-focused industries. So Kristin, welcome as well. It's a great pleasure to have you both here today, and we're going to learn a lot. So before we start, I'm just going to outline the scope of our discussion. So we're going to kick off actually with a bit of a look at what's going on right now with the regulatory changes, where we are with the processes of what we all expect to come. Then we'll look at the driving forces behind these changes to get a better understanding of why they're being put in place. We will look at some of the wider issues around regulatory competition, and then also what the crypto industry is doing to get ready for these new regulations. I want to state from the outset that this is primarily a discussion around US regulations. We shall be talking about some foreign regulations insofar as they seek to influence US regulations. And one last housekeeping point before I go is that there is a Q&A function here. We'd love to have your questions at any point. Just write them in. They will come to me. We will either answer them during the course of the discussion if they're pertaining to what we're talking about at the time, or we will collate them all and run through them at the end, where there is 15 minutes for Q&A. So get your questions in. We have two absolute experts here, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you both. So let's start off. Kristin, perhaps you could give us an overview of the various processes that are underway and some of the specifics that you're seeing emerge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks again, Nick and Prime Trust for including me here today. So yeah, we're at a really, really interesting time in the public policy regulatory landscape for crypto. You know, the important thing to remember is it's not that there is no regulation. There is plenty of regulation in the US that exists. And going back to 2013 at the federal government level, and even earlier at some state levels, agencies, both at the state and federal level, have been looking at their existing regulatory authorities and trying to figure out how it applies to crypto assets and crypto networks. And some of that has actually resulted in some pretty good guidance. I mean, I think if you look at the way FinCEN defined convertible virtual currencies and the different administrators and users and exchangers of those, and applied the Bank Secrecy Act to the crypto world, that was done in a way that today makes a lot of sense. I think the challenge that we've had is there are other agencies, particularly, like the SEC or the CFTC, where it's a little bit less clear that they have the right authority to do what they want to do. And so I think what we're seeing right now is a shift from individual agencies providing guidance to Congress, who it's now their turn to come in and clean up and provide a better framework. And so I think the big activity over in the next, sort of 18 to 24 months is really going to be congressional focused. I would also add one more thing is that as federal agencies continue to push and go too far, I think we're going to see a lot of that play out in the courts via litigation. And so, hopefully we can do it the right way, the open way, we can do it with Congress. But yeah, we're definitely shifting to a much more legislative oriented process right now.
Okay. And today, as we speak, there are 2 hearings going on, aren't there?
Yeah, it's a busy morning. We have SEC Chair Gary Gensler is testifying before the Senate Banking Committee this morning on all things related to the SEC, but obviously crypto has come up in multiple times there. He's talking about his new office. It's working on how to do disclosures of digital assets. He's once again encouraging people to come in and register with the SEC, which I think those of us in the industry know that that's actually very difficult to do. So that's the first hearing. And then simultaneously with the Senate Agriculture Committee, the chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, is testifying along with a panel of sort of crypto related witnesses. And so what's interesting is that the Senate Agriculture Committee is looking at legislation that would give the CFTC expanded authority. So there's often a little bit of a turf war between these 2 agencies as to what the right home is. Part of the reason there's a turf war is that there's 2 separate committees that have oversight, and those members of Congress, those senators and those House members, they also want to preserve their own jurisdiction. So definitely sort of an interesting theme as we try to figure out the right path forward. But very notable that we do have those 2 major hearings going on this morning.
Great. Jeremy, perhaps you can tell us some of the specific things that you're looking at from a regulatory point of view, and maybe just a brief introduction as to what Prime Trust does.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. Thanks for having us. Always great to be with Kristin, and we're very grateful for our membership on the Blockchain Association. So Prime Trust is a digital SaaS infrastructure company. We provide back-end services for a full suite of business-to-business transactions in digital asset and crypto space, everything from compliance to custody, settlement, liquidity, and so forth. We help companies who are forward-facing, customer-facing, do the back end of all of those transactions and what they need to do to provide customers digital asset services. In terms of your question and the wider perspective on regulatory affairs, I think Kristin hit it spot on. A lot of times the mantra is a call for regulatory clarity. One of the things we face in business really is the challenge of lack of regulatory efficiency. And maybe there's some semantics there about that distinction isn't important, but what I mean by that is there are so many regulations in order to comply with at the state level, 53 different markets, if you count Virgin Islands, DC, and Puerto Rico, the federal level, as well as international level. And that makes it a very challenging business operational environment for individual businesses to be able to compete and innovate in this space. But I think on the larger macro level to your question about this diverse or inefficient regulatory statuses, you get a framework that allows a full spectrum of marketplaces to flourish, and it creates potential gaps in application of rules, gaps in enforcement of necessary laws, harking back to my previous career in enforcement. And without this really coordinated, legitimized government supported regulations on a efficient scale, it inhibits the positive, innovative, licit marketplaces. And there's an infection from the harmful marketplaces to consumers. And that's ultimately the goal here, is consumer protection, consumer engagement, evolution, and expansion of the industry. Because without that familiarity, there's distrust or uncomfortable nature to engage in the space. And I think conversely, if you look at what a efficient regulatory structure would provide in terms of a national adoption, or at least a uniform state application of regulatory frameworks, you get really more consistent legal constructs to guide legal behavior, increased adoption, more familiarity, deeper understanding, and ultimately better consumer protection, because that level of comfort with the industry, with the products, reduces really the large part of what we're seeing in problems where these regulatory entities are trying to correct and insert themselves. You reduce fraud, you reduce scams, you reduce manipulation, and regulations can be seen as a competitive advantage. Companies such as ours that promote our regulatory compliance first nature are able to foster innovation and attract customers because we enable investors and developers to build in a more resilient environment, helps banks, helps payment providers, fintech companies, improving the customer experience, making settlement faster, reducing costs, and ultimately allows for product improvement, customization, and rapid development.
Thank you so much. I mean, what a list of benefits. It's very interesting that the conversation has changed, hasn't it, from, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago, where regulation was seen as a dirty word, to now it's actually one that is, people are seeing the benefits of it. I suppose my question is, the driving forces behind the regulation of the industry are slightly contrapuntal between the people within the industry and then the regulators themselves. They seem to be much more focused on consumer protection, things like illicit financing, sanctions, that kind of thing. Whereas the industry is just looking for a structure with which to grow. How do you bridge that gap? Jeremy, perhaps I can start with.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's an identity and almost a social layer conversation that needs to occur there. And admittedly, within the industry, that question hasn't been answered. I do think it's important to note that it's not a binary choice of regulation or no regulation, decentralization or centralization. There is a spectrum involved here, and I think individual market opportunities will present themselves along that spectrum, and market participants will make that choice based on their risk calculus and what they're looking to achieve within the market. But the identity and social question I think that you bring up is very important. The industry needs to have a concerted approach and a cooperative approach, as well as a determination on where it wants to address the issue. Does it want to see our industry be in a reform, evolution, modernization, and improvement of traditional financial markets and opportunities, or is it more of a revolt? Is it more of an adversarial process where we work against government, work against regulators, rulemakers, as opposed to with them? Is decentralization or profit the primary objective? How far is the industry willing to go in order to achieve those objectives? And I don't think I'm naive or unrealistically optimistic, but I do think that marriage and that union can be found to achieve both along that spectrum of decentralized applications. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, how to do that, leveraging the technology, but achieving consumer protection and regulatory frameworks.
Kristin, I think I've sort of just written your job description there.
Yeah, that's what we're working on.
Please, how do you respond?
Yeah, no, listen, I think Jeremy was right. There has been a shift in both from the industry and sort of the policymaking community about what kind of regulation is needed. So a few years ago, I was sitting down with members of Congress and even today, very important regulators, and they were saying like, oh, your industry isn't really worthy of our protection. You had federal agencies going out and doing their thing separately from that, but there was a certain amount of sentiment that this space wasn't worth spending time to think about getting it right. On the flip side, you had the industry that was resisting regulation at all costs. Now, today, I think a couple of things have happened. For the policymakers, they've seen, oh, wait, there were a couple market events that did actually harm consumers. Like maybe we need to fill those gaps there. They're also seeing that, wow, this is something that you can't open the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Financial Times without seeing an article written on it because so much is being done. This is a big space. We need to pay attention to it because a lot of the voters, the constituents, are thinking about this and participating in it. And so there's a much greater interest on policymakers, at least at the congressional level, to try to figure out the right framework. I think similarly for the industry, kind of as Jeremy described, there's a lot of different regulation today for centralized entities is not efficient, right? There's some gaps there, but there's also redundancies there, and figuring out a way to really address the risks that we care about in a more efficient way are very important. I also think that, sort of the next wave of investment in this space from institutions, and even the use by consumers, I think people would feel more comfortable if there were an appropriate regulatory framework in place. So I think it should be good for the market to have some of this cleanup that's needed. Again, it doesn't need to be drastically redone, but there are a couple concerns, particularly around stablecoins and spot market regulation, that if we can clean some of that up, I think it would really pave the way for the next stage of growth for the industry.
What is, I'd be interested to know what your association's views are on stablecoins and how they should be regulated. What's your latest thinking?
Yeah, so I think, one, it depends on how you define stablecoin. That's probably our biggest issue right now. I think there is broad agreement that if you are a centralized issuer of a dollar-backed stablecoin, that having a disclosure around where those reserves are held and what the composition is and some guidance for regulating that space would be very helpful. Today, those centralized issuers have a patchwork of money transmitter licenses. It would be great for banks to better be able to do this. It would be great to have a specialized federal license, so an issuer could have a sort of like non-bank regulatory option. We think all of that would be very helpful. What we need to make sure, though, is that those types of regulations aren't forced upon the decentralized stablecoins, right? Like if you have something like DAI that's backed by assets, it's all on chain, you have a very different set of risks than you would have with the dollar-backed stablecoin. Similarly, Congress is very interested in algorithmic stablecoins. I'm not sure they always know what they mean when they say that, but I think that making sure that we allow innovation in the stablecoin space to continue is very important, and we need to make sure that the rules just aren't applied so broadly that we don't allow these different kind of models for decentralized stable value transfer to exist.
Yeah,
Okay.
Nick, I think that's a perfect representation of the spectrum I was talking about. Kristin outlined it a lot more astutely than I did, but you look at the different stable coins she referenced, there's the spectrum right there. Different capabilities, different risk structures, different rewards, different consequences, and market participants will make their choices to enter into those markets based on all of those factors. But at different points, there are regulatory structures in place depending on the nature of the token.
Okay. Is there any sense of international competition around regulations? Do you think people look at this as a global market that could go anywhere, and whoever gets the right regulatory regime might win more business? Is that driving?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of driving it from different angles, right? I think in the US, they're feeling a bit of pressure right now because of the work that the EU has been doing with their MiCA legislation and pushing forward. I think, and so policymakers here are kind of like, oh wait, the US is sort of losing, or they're sort of dropping the ball by not moving quick enough with a new framework. Similarly, I think on the industry side, you see jurisdiction shopping. I mean, most of this work can be done online. If you're a software developer, you can live really almost anywhere and contribute to the projects that you're passionate about. And, we see people moving to different jurisdictions because of, because they're able to do more that they can't do in the US. I mean, we even see this in the state of New York, where not every product available elsewhere in the US is available in New York because of their bit license process. So we see companies that are propping up in New Jersey because they can't do what they want to do in New York. And so, yeah, I think jurisdiction hopping is a thing, but there's also competition with regulators who I think in the global scene want to be seen as taking this seriously, which I do think will drive a lot of the legislative activity, as we head into the new Congress, just given the fact that Europe is in some ways further ahead, but there are a lot of problems, I think, with the legislation that they passed. But if you're sitting in the seat as a lawmaker, you're kind of looking over there and being like, oh, those guys are way ahead of us. Like, we need to step in as well.
Yeah, Nick, I think if you look at on the conceptual level internationally, what the digital asset space is providing, using Bitcoin as an example, Bitcoin isn't challenging the US dollar or the franc or the euro, right? It is growing exponentially in developing countries. And this is a major tenet of one of the advantages of decentralized finance for bringing unbanked into the banking system. Bitcoin is more widely accepted in developing countries, even over their host currency. Countries with weak payment systems, bad payment systems, high inflation, authoritarian regimes, so on and so forth, poor intellectual property rights. And as that grows, it's even accepted in neighboring countries that don't accept that primary country's currency. And so as that grows and the technical friction reduces internationally, I think you're going to see strengthening of the network and growth in those spaces, and the US will be forced to keep up. And I think more specifically, we had a meeting this morning relative to the spot ETF that is such a huge point of conversation surrounding the market. You look at Canada, you look at Australia that have implemented Bitcoin spot ETF markets and done so successfully. I think those will serve as examples. The United States, centralized institutions here will start to see that. And I think once you get that pressure and that communication, that leverage to Congress, to rule makers, I think that the regulatory frameworks will follow to allow us to have those markets here.
Fantastic. And what is what has been your response to the coming regulatory wave, both in the US and internationally? Obviously, you've been hired, which is a good start. But what is the industry really doing as a whole?
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
No,
I have
Kristin,
thoughts on that one as well.
Go ahead, you start, please.
Yeah, no, well, I think the industry is doing a lot, and they're doing a lot more than they were a couple years ago. And we're also doing it, I think, in a way that has been incredibly effective for really what is still a relatively small industry compared to, something like the healthcare industry or the energy industry, right? And there's a couple of key pieces. First, I think having effective organizations that are working on policy is important. I think having the Blockchain Association and our 98 member companies working together is great. Our friends at the Crypto Council for Innovation, they do a wonderful job. We coordinate with them on a lot of issues. There's the DeFi Education Fund, which is run by a former alum of the Blockchain Association. They're focused on the DeFi area. Coin Center has been around forever. They do a lot of work from the individual perspective. So it's having these sort of coordinating groups that are also coordinating with one another is key. I do think also individual companies in this space are doing exactly what Prime Trust did. They brought in someone from government like Jeremy to work and think on these issues full time, because you need people thinking about policy, you need lawyers, you need lobbyists, you need communications professionals that know how to engage with government. And so I think having that layer of professional, you have people that are actually building and doing that. I do think there are some things that the industry is doing that are unique. And I would say notably our Twitter presence. If you're a policymaker that is, working to raise your profile and be in headlines, you look at your phone and your Twitter all day long. It is more direct than calling an office and leaving a message or writing your congressman and sending a letter. It is sort of an instantaneous response to what is going on. And I think that our use of Twitter sometimes maybe gets a little out of hand, but for the most part, it's a tool that other industries don't use that give us a real advantage for quick communication with policymakers. And when they do something right and we celebrate them with a, sort of a love bomb response on Twitter, they notice. And I think that's weirdly helped move the needle. I also think the crypto industry is very good, or turning the corner and really getting active when it comes to political giving. Political giving is a great way for building relationships with members of Congress and candidates that are, interested and open to learning about crypto. And so I've been really proud that the industry is getting more involved. We just launched a PAC at the Blockchain Association. There's a great group called GMI PAC that has been doing a lot of work with individual, races around the country. So So the tools are coming in place, some which are tried and true, and some, sort of like Twitter, which are really unique to this community.
Fantastic. Thank you for that overview. Jeremy, what are you seeing? And maybe also, what are you seeing as being some of the technology that can be brought into play to help with the regulations that are coming?
Yeah, so I think Kristin's spot on that. This is DC. This is politics with a capital P. It's based on relationships, and forming those relationships are key. Real estate's about location, location, location. This is about engagement, engagement, engagement. We have to be involved. We have to be participating in these conversations with legislators, regulators, rulemakers, law enforcement, and the full spectrum. And that, I think, takes a couple different forms. One is through associations. As Kristin said, for us, we're fortunate to be a part of the Blockchain Association and the phenomenal team there, and certainly benefit from that engagement. But there's also, an internal component to this on the business level, being part of a self-regulatory organizational structure that exists within the industry that ensures compliance and regulatory first culture, perspective, personnel, strategies, technology, and so forth. And that translates into our business operations through our compliance departments, through our sales product development teams that do everything with the North Star of ensuring that everything we do is in compliance with regulatory structures at all state, federal, and international levels. And I think it's important to note that highlighting the success of the industry in a really pretty broad spectrum of ways to do that. Probably the best example as of last night is the merge. I mean, one of the biggest challenges within the industry is the environmental impact. You can see how it affected legislation in New York. You see how it's brought up frequently in federal legislative conversations. Well, the industry went through a very significant, very technologically complex, very impactful shift of consensus mechanism on its primary, secondary, however you want to rank it, protocol. Did so successfully in order to address that issue. It shows the forward-leaning regulatory, ESG, and mindset of the industry to be successful, do things the right way. And if that's communicated to regulators and rulemakers, the understanding will be, okay, this isn't a tool for fraud, scam, abuse, and illicit finance, that this misinformation and false narrative seems to circle around the industry.
Yeah, and I would add, Jeremy, I think, said something super important. The best tool that we have is to build really great things that people want, right? And people wanted a greener blockchain. Now we have an option for that. But if we can actually build services that are useful to everyday individuals and consumers that are built on, open blockchain networks, that's how we're going to win, right? And I know some people criticize the use of this, but I'm going to use it anyway. Uber took on the taxi cab commissions because there were a whole lot of people out there that liked Uber, and so the more that we get individuals that are using NFTs or using services that are built off of Ethereum or any other number of smart contract platforms out there, the better off we are, because even today there was a great interview that Brad Sherman did. I want to say it was for Cointelegraph. I'm not 100% sure, but he had said that we should have banned this stuff years ago, but it's too late because too many people have Bitcoin now. And it's like, yeah, that's right. You can't just knock this out. And I think that means that ultimately, as long as the industry does all of this engagement that Jeremy was talking about, if we build those relationships, we're going to be fine. We will come up with a regulatory regime that is workable for the industry. But we can't ease up on that. We have to continue. New people come into government all the time. New people get elected all the time. It takes a lot of engagement to get a policymaker to the point where they really understand what we're doing. And so we have to just keep doing that over and over and over again. And I think then ultimately we'll have, the right knowledge base in place to get really good policy.
And how does the industry, I suppose, keep its identity in this regulated future, not just of itself, but how does it not get subsumed into just being another part of the wider financial services industry? How can you maintain your difference?
If I can jump on that, Chris, I will challenge you a little bit, Nick, because I think that presents the question in that binary way that I think we can avoid, right? It's not that industry and this industry. I think the two centralized and decentralized approaches can be brought together. And I apologize, I did not answer the technology second part of your question. Yeah. So I'll address that in this answer, because I think it's applicable to both questions. Because the risks that are associated in traditional finance are the same risks that are associated here. There's fire sales, runs, deleveraging, contamination, fraud, scam, manipulation. Those exist in traditional finance. They exist in decentralized finance. And the way to approach them, to your question about how they come together, is you realize that this technology is making traditional financial markets better, stronger, more effective, faster, cheaper, more international, so on and so forth. It's not completely discounting those institutions and those mechanisms. It's enhancing them using modernization, using blockchain technology, using decentralized approaches that also have additional benefits beyond those that exist. There are certainly technological differences between the two. Same risks, same laws kind of mantra. I don't necessarily subscribe to an extent. Once you reach into that new technology, and here's where the technology part comes in my opinion, you can achieve what we're trying to achieve through decentralization, leveraging the technology through RegTech, the underlying blockchain smart contract technology for regulation, compliance, monitoring, enforcement, as well as soup tech, as well as embedded supervision, using cryptographic tools to report aggregated financial exposures without disclosing underlying individual transactions, complying with Basel III or other requirements in the banking industry, automatically verified through this technology, using the technology for full asset backing verification when we get to that stable coin issuance and legislation we talked about earlier. I think you have to do an iterative approach, start with regulatory sandboxes or some other type of Hester Peirce's safe harbor or some type of environment there to get there. But I don't want to approach this as, well, how do we do this as a versus conversation as opposed to a together conversation?
Yeah, and I think what Jeremy was saying, you'll hear regulators or policymakers be like, well, sort of same service, same risk, same regulation. Well, it may be the same service from an end user perspective, right? Like, oh, I need to, want to borrow some crypto with, a collateralized loan or something like that. But the reality is it is a different risk, right? Because you have the blockchain, you have smart contracts, it's just the risks are off. And many of these services, there's not a third party that has custody over an asset, depending on what you're doing. And so it's really just much more complex than taking the old rules and applying them to the new. There's a ton of nuance there. And we've seen this sort of like I was alluding to with stable coins earlier, right? Like there's some talk of just, applying the same set of rules to all stable coins. It's like, actually, maybe that's the industry's fault. We have the same names for three totally different things. That happens, like with exchange regulation as well. I mean, this is one of the issues that came up in the hearing today on the Hill, is that a decentralized exchange is a very different beast than a centralized exchange, and they should have the regulations that apply in the centralized context simply don't work for DeFi, and so it becomes a much more complicated endeavor to figure out the regulation for the entire space. And so it's one of the reasons that, and I think Europe did this well, let's focus on the centralized entities first, and then we can worry about what, if anything, needs to be done for DeFi a little bit further down the road.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think, Nick, this has been at least attempted for a long time. Back in 2015, Wall Street looked to do blockchain-based settlements and clearing systems. they realized the industry realized that that information would have been too public, and therefore trades would have been known by competitors, and it wasn't going to work. But this effort for merge, I don't want to use the word merge, obviously, in this context, but the marriage between these two, concepts has been approached for a long period of time. And I think even if you look a little bit, this may be a stretch, but if you look at embedded finance or banking as a service, that really is a technological removal of the consumer from centralized institutions. On the front end, I fully get that on the back end, it is 100% centralized. But from a consumer endpoint perspective, that's straight from consumer to service without going through the bank. I know, again, back end it does. But I think and maybe I'm too, ephemeral in this, but I think once you start that thought process and establish that level of comfort with, hey, I don't have to go through a bank to pay my bills, I'm just going to go to the bill provider or bill issuer, that's a psychological step on the road to start us down decentralization. That'll be a comfort level. It's just, the actual application of it needs to be improved. But I think we're starting that process and have been doing so for some time.
We are, absolutely. And just in case anyone was running a book on how long it took before we mentioned the merge, it was 27 minutes. Exactly. So it took us 27 minutes to get there. Anyway, we've had lots of questions. We're having lots of questions. This is generating so much interest. It's great to see. And I'm going to actually dive in because they're all quite, they're interesting, specific, but all quite different. And I think it would be remiss of us to carry on just talking about the big issues when people are asking for some specifics. So understandably, the first question is around the SEC, and it says the SEC seems to have been going out of its way to avoid saying whether ETH is or is not a security, and appears to be walking back William Hinman's former statements. Do you think the SEC's view may change in light of the merge, and will it potentially differentiate between staked and unstaked ETH?
Yeah, I'm super excited to read. It just came out right before I sat down. Coin Center has an analysis on this very question that they put out today. So I would encourage folks to check that out. Even without having read it, I'm sure it's phenomenal. They do great work. But Gary Gensler has been very notably not committing to anything being a commodity other than Bitcoin, right? I think that's all very clear given the origin story. There's a couple theories for that. One is that he wants regulation over all crypto assets except for Bitcoin. I mean, he even said today in this hearing that he thinks of the 10,000 digital assets out there, that a vast majority of them are securities. So I think he does have a question around ETH. Now, whether his colleagues agree with him and, if there were to be some sort of challenge, the court would agree with him is really another question. What is interesting is if you look at the bill that was discussed in the Senate Agriculture Committee today, they specifically call out Bitcoin and Ethereum as a commodity. And so right. I think Gensler, if he really does believe ETH as a security, is somewhat alone in that analysis. The other analysis that I've heard is that given that there is this ongoing enforcement action against Ripple and that there's a lot of activity going on this fall, that he is sort of staying out of talking about Hinman, talking about Ethereum, because that is being brought up a lot in that case. And so, but yeah, he is very clearly distanced himself from committing to say that ETH is a commodity. And obviously, not something we would want to happen as an industry. And I am not a securities lawyer, but I'm surrounded by very wonderful, oftentimes expensive lawyers. And, their consensus is that the case that ETH as a security is not strong. It really is a commodity given how decentralized it is and how critical it is for the operation of the Ethereum network. So I think we have a good ground to stand on, but yeah, it's certainly not great to have the head of the SEC, declining to comment that it is a commodity.
Well, we've got a very interesting comment from a former SEC attorney here, who is writing to us under the cloak of strictest anonymity. He says, I'm frustrated too. To be fair, most of the things crypto community relied on from the SEC are not authoritative, but some of it is honestly not the SEC's fault. So there you've had it from within the organization, from within. Moving on, will a federal approval to operate in the crypto space be superseded by state licensing requirements? OCC has provided federal clearance for banks to assume crypto custody, such as Anchorage. New York State requires virtual currency licensing for anyone offering VC to a New York resident. Will entities require multiple licenses and approvals? Jeremy?
I think that's an open question. But yeah, Jeremy, I know Prime Trust has many licenses. I might have thoughts on that.
I think the short answer is yes, multiple licenses. Ideally, I think federal universal legislation will set the tone for states and allow for states to have a more uniform approach. And there have been proposals on this, the Uniform Token Registration Act, the Model Money Transmission Modernization Act, which is a mouthful. Both propose a unified universal state level approach, as well as, applying federal laws on top of that. I mean, I get pushback when I speak to regulators to some extent about arguing for, this universal or consistent approach. They say get in line because traditional finance has been clamoring for that for decades. So I think it exists in the financial industry as a whole. But the short answer is I think we'll both have a state framework as well as a federal framework, similar to what we do for traditional financial markets.
Okay. Another question, I think we've sort of just answered this, but are either of you able to address MSBs? Any chance of the proposed multi-state single form license happening?
I don't mean to be pessimistic. I think those types of regulatory approaches are secondary to larger questions surrounding, who will be the regulator. I think stable coins will be the first approach. I think MSBs will follow shortly after, and then MTLs will follow shortly after that. But I think until we answer some foundational questions first and get those regulations established, I think the actual operational implementation may come after that. Hopefully it can be packaged together, but that question, at least in my conversations, has been secondary.
This is a kind of a cri de coeur, and it says, how do we ensure that we're within the regulations when the policies and guidelines are often non-existent? From a reporting standpoint, how to treat DeFi products, staking, liquidity pools, etc. Yeah, what should people do if they think the regulations are coming, they don't know what exactly they are? How should they treat things? What's your advice?
Yeah, well, I would say, unfortunately, one of the key things you want to do, especially if you're building or launching a DeFi protocol, is you do want to consult really good lawyers, because there are a lot of things that you do run into. Like, for example, like if you're doing DeFi derivatives, you probably want to geofence the US because you have to have a license right now under laws to do that. I do think there are some best practices out there. There's an attorney who just left DYDX and went over to Polygon, Mark Boiron, who has written, his last name is Boiron, first name Marc. If you Google his name, he has a really good sort of document that outlines, what you should think about when you're trying to decentralize a protocol. And I think that's one of the best resources I've seen out there. But, I think there is, to a certain extent, some sort of safety in numbers. If other protocols are kind of going down a certain course, that has been approved by lots of lawyers, you're probably good with that strategy. But if, there were some practices early on, particularly back when we were looking at ICOs, that people don't do anymore, right? Because the SEC came in either with an enforcement action or some sort of statement that's changed. So yeah, I would highly encourage getting really good counsel to help you with this, because you don't want to be the subject, I think, of an SEC enforcement action.
And is there a danger that that regulations might actually just emerge through enforcement? And with that,
yes,
the worst of systems.
Yes. I mean, that and that's, when you look at sort of the SEC, a lot of what we get on the security side, there has been some guidance, but enforcement actions have often sort of dictated the policy. And listen, like enforcement actions, when there is actual fraud or bad activity or very clear violations, we want that, right? We want that out of our space. We want that out of our ecosystem. Not welcome here. But when it's on these sort of areas where, boy, it's just really a gray area, trying to get this sort of clarity by enforcement is not the ideal way to make policy, because the decisions that the court have to make are based off of the facts and circumstances of just a very limited data set. And there isn't the opportunity, for groups like us, outside of maybe filing an amicus brief, to really get in and do education and engage and provide feedback and be a part of the process. Because, you want a good policy is made when you're looking at the whole ecosystem, how everybody's working together, people get a chance to improve. Even like this bill, for example, that the Senate Agriculture Committee is doing today, and the Blockchain Association, we love that they have put that out there for comment. We love that the Agriculture Committee wants to give CFTC more authority. We don't love that one of the definitions might capture DeFi, or that there isn't clarity on a couple other issues, but at least we get a chance to go back and forth with them and have these discussions and let it build out over time. So, would much prefer going the legislative route, where we can have these open discussions and the back and forth, as opposed to trying to see these policy questions settled by litigation.
Okay. Jeremy, do you have
That being said, we will sue if we think they've overstepped. It's not ideal, but we will do that. Okay. It's not a walkover. Jeremy, do you have any last thoughts about some of these issues?
Yeah, I would like to expand a little on that question. I think, first and foremost, it's about consumer protection. That is the number one focus in all conversations, regardless of its legislator, rulemaker, law enforcement, or others. So to answer the question about what does a company do relative to regulations and how do they prepare for it, with consumer protection as your foundation, moving forward in all the ways that Kristin suggested, but in addition, certifications or authorizations relative to cybersecurity standards, whether it's through ISO or SOC certifications and others, is to strengthen your network is probably your primary step. There's also a good faith approach that I've found. There are enforcement actions, but if you are acting in good faith, reporting when you're in question about should I report, should I register, should I inform, if you take that step, I do think there is, this is not the common narrative, but I do think government is willing to work with you and not look to be punitive at the outset. And then finally, just internal strength of compliance programs, transparency, and communication. But to answer your question on a broader sense of next steps or looking forward, I think very important, first, to address the narrative. I constantly wrestle with the negative narrative, misinformation, and mischaracterization of the industry. I spent a lot of years in investigating, due to my age, it was less technically advanced, but it was credit card fraud, identity fraud, and those types of crimes. At no point during that time did anyone question the legitimacy of the credit card industry. And the numbers involved there dwarf what we're dealing with here. For some reason, the industry as a concept gets called into question simply when it's used as a tool to commit illicit financial activities, which any industry in the financial market is used. And I do think the identity question will continue to be very, very important. Establishing a cooperative versus adversarial approach with centralized and traditional financial and regulatory and government institutions is going to be imperative for the industry to continue to grow.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you both. I know that Kristin, you've got a meeting that you've another webinar you've got to rush off to, so we've got to give you a break.
I'm back to back today. Lots of going on in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. Busy. So look, both of you, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've heard exactly where we are with the latest regulations. We've heard what's driving the industry, both, well, the regulatory side and the industry's response. And we've heard very interestingly from the audience that there is still this discussion about how to actually classify coins or tokens, securities or commodities, and how that fits into the regulatory approach. There's obviously a lot of concern, actually, given the number of questions that we did have, which I didn't answer them all because I think we answered them in process, about this distinction between multiple licenses in multiple jurisdictions. State level, federal level, local level. It's going to be, it's likely to continue. That doesn't seem as if that's going to get any easier. And then, what is actually going to end up in the future here over the next 3 years? A much more, hopefully, a much more regulated industry, one that doesn't accept the bad actors, that has got the proper legislation supporting it. That the rules aren't being decided in courts and through enforcement actions. So it's a busy space, and there's an awful lot to do. So I want to thank our two speakers again today. It's been absolutely enlightening. Jeremy and Kristin, good luck with everything, and keep up the good work.
Thank you both.
Thank you. And goodbye to the audience.